This one's really important, not only because money's important and it's the lifeblood of most organizations, but this one just seems to be like really tough. So I'm curious, you guys, all three of you have sat on the customer side of this world and CISO world, all this kind of stuff. What are some best practices around budget specifically for this?
Yeah, so the typical, what you see for averages for like an IT budget, right, is between 4 and 7%, generally speaking. Um, and then the one of the core issues is that usually the cyber security budget is a subset of the IT budget. And that's one of the main challenges because you're directly putting form and function against security, right? That do you go out and do you buy a bunch of servers, or do you go out and do you buy some security equipment or
You have
or
competing
licensing?
priorities.
Right, you have competing priorities in that regard. And the cyber, I would say that the rule of thumb um, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 to 14% of the IT budget goes towards cybersecurity. So it's not even really half. And that's I think that's one of the major challenges that you have when you're talking to people that have to use these budgets and create these budgets and go and sell these budgets. It's easy to say, oh, well, we need 20, 40 servers to go and scale X, Y, and production on X, Y, and Z application, whatever. That's the people that have the money go, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But it's difficult for them to turn around and, like I was saying earlier, go and say, hey, well, I need to go and spend X, Y, and Z for vulnerability management, and I need new firewalls because our old ones don't cut it anymore. And there's a new next gen antivirus that deals with all the latest threats, and I need micro segmentation, and we should probably start looking at containerization because that's and right. So and all that's got to come out of one little piece out of another little piece of a budget. This becomes a very difficult thing to try to sell to to your CFO or CEO, whoever owns the purse strings. But I think there's a way, and and I've used this in the past that has been able to kind of work around that and be able to get cyber budget that's outside of really the IT budget. And we normally go after some of the budget that they put into the risk category. So their risk mitigation and their risk portfolio. So we'll normally, start classifying some of the cyber budget not only as an IT expense, because you still need generally speaking, still need firewalls and those kinds of things, but you can specifically start talking about risk and how much risk you are mitigating, and that can be tied to dollar figures. And you do that with really quantitative budget analysis, and you're looking at what risks are out there and not the likelihood of them. That's qualitative. How much will they cost and how likely is it to happen? That's kind of what everybody, in the cyber world has been using since, the beginning of time. But really going more into the qualitative analysis. And Dan's really an expert on more of the qualitative, how that happens. So I'll let him talk about that a little bit more. But it's really a shift in how you think about how much you should be spending in cyber to mitigate risk.
Yeah, Joe. So you're right. Quantitative, qualitative. It's something that we hear these terms tossed around a lot, and people kind of get them mixed up. And I tend to focus on quantitative because I'm a math guy. I want to see the numbers, and it helps me when I'm trying to convince like other executives, like the VP of finance. If I'm trying to convince other executives about why the security budget should be higher, it's usually easier for me when I do the math. and I show them, it's very much like insurance calculations when they're trying to calculate, how often does a flood happen? And then if we flood, what kind of damage are we going to take? Or like the cost to recover from a flood. It's very similar. And so when you take all that same kind of mentality of trying to plan ahead for disaster recovery, all of that can be applied also to cybersecurity. For example, think of a ransomware attack. If the ransomware attack takes the whole company offline and maybe it takes you a month to recover, now you can calculate your loss of revenue for a month. Just very simple. And I know there are things that are more complicated than that. But if your annual loss expectancy could be 30 days and your annual rate of occurrence, maybe that only happens once a year or once every 3 years or once every 5 years, it's exactly like a flood, trying to calculate flood damage. So when you base your security budget on the math with this quantitative analysis, it's much easier to get the executive buy-in, right? Like when you're talking to other people that are not security experts, like us, or they don't have a security partner like Blue Team Alpha. Now it's a lot easier for them to understand the risk that they have. Like if we go offline for 30 days, that's going to be a significant hit to our revenue. And you don't want to spend more than the loss, because that wouldn't make financial sense if you tried to tell the CEO like, oh, I need $1 million for security to prevent a $500,000 loss. Then that, of course, that's not going to get approved. But if you came in under the expected loss to say, well, I think if I had a budget of $100,000, I could prevent $500,000 in damages every year. That's pretty much a green light.
Yeah, I was going to say it's usually, they're going to insure probably up to that top line amount, and give a percentage basis of that risk to mitigate it. So, so they'll give up, commonly 10 to 20%, something like that to mitigate the risk. And then they'll insure anything that's above that. That's what I've at least experienced when working with CFOs and CEOs on more of this type of a budget and risk calculation.
Yeah.
Ryan, what about you?
Have you seen?
What have you seen?
Me?
Yeah.
I'm happy to talk about it from a quantitative perspective. I think a lot of times people who have to deal with security budgets and they have to deal with trying to get money for their department, and I've had, early on, if you start talking in this way of these risks and you give this outsize, like, oh, I mean, you do the calculation and you're like, oh God, like this is how much money we could lose every time. If you're looking at it from a risk perspective, you'd amortize that across the incidence rate. And
Right.
and if they look at the situation and you say like, hey, well, it hasn't happened yet. So, I mean, we've been operating for 5 years. There is a way to address this. In statistics, it's called the rule of three. If you look it up, it allows you to predict with a 0.95 confidence ratio. If an event has not occurred in a certain amount of samples, it will tell you the likelihood of that event not occurring with a 95%. It'll give you the incidence rate. It's really interesting. I've been able to use it to effectively argue for budget because I was able to show how amortized across the time delta that it was actually cheaper on a cost basis. It's like the same thing you do with drive failure rate, right? You're showing how like, hey, it's actually cheaper to go with this than to live with that risk, because that risk is divided across the amount of time. And unless you can really convince them, like, here is the rate that is going to happen, then yeah, oh, scary, millions of dollars. But if you don't know how to take it across the incidence rate, it's much harder to convince people, like bean counters who are really good at it, I guess you would say.
Yeah.
So that'd be my perspective on that. So I've had a lot of success with that in a number of different scenarios, and not just for security budgets. So
a really good report for people that I recommend to use for that kind of data comparison to get good data is from FBI Cybercrime. They have the IC3 report that comes out every year about all the statistics that they've collected from victims, how much money they lost, what type of attack it was, what system was affected. That's, if you need some statistics to pull the data from to do the math, that's the one that I typically recommend. 2023 hasn't come out yet. I just checked it this morning. They only have up until 2022, but 23 should be coming out soon.